the big question for both Bryan and David. Is Jimmy Butler worth a supermax at this stage of his career? David, first.
No, I don't think he is.
That was pretty straightforward. All right, welcome to the YouTube exclusive or the YouTube extended cut. We already have had David on for a lot of Heat talk, but we decided to go a little bit further because we will be talking about Jimmy Butler, who is apparently looking for a contract extension. We think that warrants a conversation in and of itself. So welcome to the NBA show where we'll just have that conversation. And leading us off here is the big question for both Bryan and David. Is Jimmy Butler worth a supermax at this stage of his career? David, first.
No, I don't think he is.
That was pretty straightforward.
I think that's fair, though, right? You see what Jimmy did in the playoffs. You see what he's done over the course of his career. And look, Miami's already seen this play out with Dwayne Wade, a guy who relied so heavily on his athleticism and getting to the line and drawing contact and things of that sort. And I think Jimmy is perhaps even a more magnified version of that, where like part of what made him so effective during the regular season and not as effective during the postseason was the fact that he didn't get a lot of foul calls in his favor. And all those fouls, all that contact, that's an additional wear and tear. You take the Tom Thibodeau factor, and the fact that he's got a lot of miles on those legs, and you wonder whether or not he's going to be able to uphold. Like if you're going to be paying him $50 million a year at age 36, you have some serious questions about whether or not he can live up to that type of contract. And there's no shot there. He's not a reliable three-point shooter. If the mid-range game continues to be a part of his arsenal, that's fine. But again, look, it wasn't a factor for him against the Milwaukee Bucks. And so what's next for him as far as his offensive repertoire is concerned? Is he just getting to the line? Is he just finishing around the rim? Do you want to pay a 36-year-old guard, $50 million a year to get 10 to 12 free throws per game? I just don't know that he can sustain that. So to me, I think there have to be a lot of questions about whether or not you give him that sort of contract. And he has to be honest and upfront about whether or not he's capable of living up to that contract and whether or not he wants to put the team in that kind of position where they're paying him so much money and not getting a lot of value out of that type of deal.
Bryan, I assume you are in full agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I just think we've had this conversation a number of times, especially when you get into that final tier of max contract where a guy is eligible to earn 35% of the max or of the full salary cap that year. There just aren't that many guys in the NBA who deserve it. I'm not saying Jimmy Butler isn't a top 15-ish player right now, because I think he is, and he's. If he had not gotten COVID and missed a number of games this season, he'd be a lock for an all-NBA team. So this is no disrespect to Jimmy Butler. It's just I would probably limit the number of guys who I'd pay that type of money to like 7, 8 at most. And I think once you get into that next tier, that's where it starts to get slippery. Similar, Lord knows I was a critic of Tobias Harris's max contract or near max contract. It's a similar comparison to where like he's in a tier below what he ended up getting, but he's still a great player. I'm not saying like Jimmy Butler's a bum. It's just I wouldn't want to pay 35% of my cap space when I already have another max guy in Bam Adebayo, because it gets progressively more difficult once you have two guys on huge contracts to build competently around them. And as we discussed on the podcast, Miami already has a number of big decisions to make this summer with regard to Victor Oladipo, Kendrick Nunn, Duncan Robinson. So I don't want to say they're going to get locked in necessarily, because Pat Riley is very creative and Lord knows he's worked his way out of trickier situations in the past. But there's a risk that depending on how this summer shakes out, this is the main Heat core for the next couple seasons. And, do you want to be paying a 36-year-old Jimmy Butler $30 or $50 million? No, I don't think you want to be paying many 36-year-olds $50 million.
I agree. And I'm so glad you brought up the 35%, because here's the thing. For me, it's really about age. If this had been a 26-year-old Jimmy Butler, you know what? Give him the full 35% max. I'm good with that. That's okay. I could live with that if that had been age 26. At this point, however, like, no, it would be beyond stupid from an organizational perspective to put that kind of money on your books moving forward, because you just know that the final couple of years, at the very least, would not justify the level of compensation from his production. So to me, that again offers that old thing that I've been talking about. I wrote about it for Forbes, I think 2 years ago. I brought it up on the podcast as well. I think I even did a video with Keith Smith on this channel about it. I want to see the 30% max and the 35% max get switched around. So let's just break that down first and foremost, Brian, because it's a bit complicated. So when after your 7th season, that's when you get eligible for 30% of the cap, and that lasts until your 9th season, or entering your 10th rather, in which case after your 10th year of service, you qualify for 35% of the max. And to me, it's illogical that when you have passed the 10-year threshold in the NBA, you're supposedly worth the most. That is usually when guys decline. So I just cannot get on board with the structure of how the max contract concept has been developed. I think you need to switch those around, because presumably, or more logically, when you look at the history of the league, guys who are in their 7th year or somewhere along those lines, they play the best brand of basketball that they ever will. Why not use that period of time to compensate them far more than when they're on the back burner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fair point. Like, there are a lot of things about how the NBA salary structures work that just don't really make a ton of sense. We've railed about, contract extensions as well, where like you're limited to paying, if a guy's not on a max deal, you can only pay 120% of what he's currently earning. So like with Draymond Green a couple of years ago with the Warriors, it's like it behooved him to not sign an extension because he could get more money in free agency. It's similar here. It just doesn't make sense for a guy as he's getting past his prime. Like, I understand, sure, you don't want to commit that type of money to, a guy who isn't proven, but 7 years in the NBA, you're usually pretty proven by that point. So, I would much rather pay someone the most amount of money in his prime, where I'm more confident that he's actually going to produce at the star or superstar level that I expect, rather than, Jimmy Butler. It's also the salary structure too, right? Like, ideally, you could, if you really wanted to give him the 35% max, it'd be great if you could just divvy up the money however you want. So, you can pay him that 50 million chunk in his age 33 season, and then it goes down every year, rather than how it would have to be. He's going to be earning 3 million more per year, or 3.2 million more per year. And then we get to age 36 season and he's at 50.3 million. There's just, you're forcing teams to sign contracts where there's almost no way that's going to age well.
Right.
So my concern is that I think the team will give him the contract. And maybe you were leading up to this in the conversation, but to me, I think they will give him the deal. Maybe you think it is beyond stupid, but I feel like, given what we've seen from this franchise, I think they believe so much in Jimmy, and I think were so appreciative of the fact that he signed with the team a couple of years ago and that he carried the team to the finals and everything else, that I think they are willing to give him the deal. My question, though, is whether or not Jimmy will take it, and I don't know if he will. And a big part of that is ego. As we know in the NBA, you want to be the guy who gets the big bucks, who gets top paid, the kind of cachet that comes with being a supermax player and things of that sort. But I don't know if he necessarily fits that sort of category, and I don't know if he necessarily wants to hamstring the organization to that point. Like, I'm all for players getting as much money as they possibly can, so it's not an indictment on Jimmy one way or the other. If he gets that money, good for him. But I also don't know that necessarily he's wired that way. Like, we talked about this in the podcast about how Jimmy approaches the game and his work ethic and everything else like that. That's not to say that he doesn't want money. Obviously he does, but I don't know that he necessarily wants to handicap. And that's what it is. He's going to handicap his franchise 5 years down the road if he takes that deal, because they're not going to be able to get much on that roster aside from him and Bam Adebayo. And that's why I think, however, that Riley and that front office are willing to give it, because they always act very short-sighted. They always move now, knowing that they can always trade a player down the road, or maybe the salary cap takes another substantial leap, and maybe they can add a third superstar. It's a weird situation for them to be in, but I think that they would want to give Jimmy that kind of money as a sign of good faith, and kind of repaying him for his decision to come here in the first place and save the franchise from the mediocrity that they were in before he joined.
Yeah, you just brought up something interesting there. You said trade him later. That to me is the big question mark. Can you trade him later on that deal? Because
we saw Russell Westbrook. I mean, yeah, John Wall.
Well, I mean, yeah, I get that, but at the same time, that was also for one of those atrocious contracts, and you didn't really know whether John Wall could even, let's be honest, play basketball at a reasonable level. Sure. I mean, that was a huge gamble, first and foremost, but secondarily, I mean, we're looking at someone who can't shoot. And I think, to me, that's the deal breaker. That's where you go, okay, so if his athleticism goes, all right, well, then he could just be a spot-up shooter. Well, he can't, because he's not a great shooter.
Right.
So how do you even age gracefully if you're Jimmy Butler and you lose your first step, if you lose that physical advantage? So yeah. The decline could be so drastic.
Yeah, no, all fair points. And look, we saw him be willing to take the three-point shot in the playoffs. I don't know if he kind of recognizes that that's where his game has to trend. You wonder whether or not he's going to focus on that over the offseason, because, I mean, I'd love to see it. And again, I made the point about Dwayne and his tenure in Miami. This was a player who aged, and, he had those occasional bursts where he had a 15-point outing and everybody's talking about vintage Wade. But he, that was a lot of that was based on whatever athleticism he had, and a lot of trick shottery that he was taking there. Like, there were a lot of athletic moves to the basket, but not really like any kind of polished offense there, and no shooting from the perimeter. With Jimmy, you'd like to see at least incorporate. I mean, he has to get to 33%, 35% shooting from 3-point range, and in fact, his career has trended in the other direction. He's shot worse in his tenure in Miami, even as his offense has mostly been very, very efficient, other than his shooting. So I don't know. I don't know if he's going to recognize that in him and say, I have to develop a 3-point shot. That's a hard question for players to answer, especially a guy like Jimmy, who has worked as hard as he has to be this successful, and he has to look in that mirror and say, you know what, I'm not good as a player if I can't hit that 3-point shot.
I think for me, the biggest thing is like the Blake Griffin situation. Mm-hmm. I mean, Bryan and I we asked that question a few weeks, I think, even before he got bought out by the Pistons. We were asking, like, is he literally untradeable? Because he was just such a non-factor. There was so much money left on the books, and I wouldn't be shocked if by the end of his age 35 season, Jimmy Butler, that is, if he got that contract, that he would find himself in a similar situation. But, and in which case, if that happens, then you might be forced to buy him out.
That's a good point. I hadn't considered that. I'm very glad you brought that up, because even now in listening to it, that makes sense, because that's where you kind of feel like they maybe is much more synergy in terms of the player and the organization, where you say, look, we are so grateful to you for the last 2 years of service. We know we're going to pay you this money. We're going to give you this contract. But 3 years, 4 years down the road, if we both have an honest assessment of where you are as a player and where we are as a franchise, and we feel like there has to be a mutual moving on, then you have to be able to work with us and take a substantial buyout. And we'll never disclose that amount. Miami, already a franchise that's very secretive and acts in their own way without leaking almost anything, even to a guy like Woj. So that makes a lot of sense then, where they buy him out, and it wouldn't be like, he wouldn't have to lose face publicly. He'll still get the cachet of the contract. He'll get the big status that comes with that kind of a deal. And then at 35, 36, if he has to move on and go elsewhere because he's declined, because the team has declined and they're ready to move on, they could work out some sort of agreement. So that's the silver lining for what could be a very dark cloud for Miami's future.
And I'll just say, no one's totally untradeable. Like, if the Pistons wanted to give up 3 first-round picks to get off of Blake Griffin's contract, they could have. Miami could be in a spot where they could get off of Jimmy Butler's contract, but they would just have to give up so much extra value that it almost just behooves them. As David said, I would be curious to see how the NBA polices that kind of thing. Like, I don't think you could have it such an under the table agreement when you're signing him to that extension, but I also don't know how you prove that they have that under the table agreement. So I'd be curious to see how it plays out. But yeah,
a team option would definitely be easier.
Yeah. Or just like a, partially guaranteed or fully non-guaranteed fourth year. Yeah.
Joel Embiid's contract, which you should be intimately familiar with, at least more than us, that had just a lot of like, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like conditionals. Yeah, exactly. Just in terms of what he lives up to, and I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, it was like playing time, but then also certain injuries if he suffered. A certain portion of the contract would not be guaranteed. With Jimmy, I don't know if you could do the injury part because I can't think of like, he doesn't have a chronic problem with injuries, but yeah, I guess you could put, if you don't play 2,000 minutes and you're age 34.
They'll start to pile up soon, Brian, unfortunately.
Or the like, if your body fat percentage is not below 5%.
Now, credit to Andy Ellisberg, the team's general manager. Like, he's found very creative ways of getting the team under the salary cap in the past because of those kind of incentive bonuses. Like Kelly Olynyk's contract, base was, I think he had to play a certain number of games in order to get a significant bonus, and that kept him under the cap. And then that came up very loudly when Eric Spoelstra just benched him, strangely enough, last season, and he wasn't getting the kind of playing time that a lot of people expected him to. So I think the team is more than willing to incorporate those kinds of incentives into a deal, but I don't know. It's going to be strange to see how it plays out.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think it's just such an interesting dynamic. I think because you have Bam who's on the upswing, and that's why I would really hate to see them lock in Jimmy for the long term and maybe just burden Bam with what could be an albatross contract down the line, because then you're getting an impatient Bam at some point during that whole period. And like Brian said, if you have to give up multiple draft picks to get off of a Jimmy Butler, for example, that only makes your team worse, both in the short term and the long term. At that point in time, are we then absolutely sure that Bam just wouldn't say, you know what, get me the hell out of here?
Yeah. No, those are really legitimate questions. And look, he's locked into a nice deal too, but you wonder whether or not he's going to have those kind of issues. The pressure is on him to be able to lead this team, especially if Jimmy continues to decline and things of that sort. So, yeah, that's it's going to be an interesting test for. And look, and Pat Riley has talked about it before. Like, I mean, he might be on his way out too, and whoever takes over the organization at that point and leads them to that next phase of wherever this franchise goes, will have those kind of interesting decisions. And look, as much as the team gets blasted for the branding of heat culture and everything else, like every player that I've talked to about it recognizes that the one thing that makes Miami different than almost every other franchise in the NBA is the consistency that came with Pat Riley when he joined the organization in 1995. That's what the culture is all about. The accountability that everybody who walks through those doors has to face, from the front office to the players. And then, there's a stability there because the same guys have been there since 1995. If you've been with a team for 5 years, you're practically a rookie. Everybody else, it has to be there for almost decades at this point. And so you wonder whether or not when Riley eventually decides to retire, and nobody knows when that's going to be, whoever takes over the team, whether it's Shane Battier or somebody from the outside, whether or not they make these kind of drastic changes and decide that maybe Jimmy's not the guy that they want on their team. Maybe Bam's not the guy that they want on their team. It's going to be an interesting couple of years for Miami, as it almost always is around the NBA.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, David. Just generally heat culture and well, just the culture from them, and at the same time, Portland as well. I think those two franchises over the past couple of years have really stood out in the grand context of like NBA teams and chemistry and camaraderie and togetherness. Those teams have just done such a tremendous job in making themselves attractive on some level because of those established cultures, because they have culture setters, whether that's on the court. In Portland's case, that's of course Dame, whether that's in the front office in Miami with Pat, and that's actually a pretty good point also, just in terms of you can upgrade your roster through that reputation. You don't necessarily have to bottom out at any point, because there are going to be stars who think, you know what, I want to be part of a family culture system. I want to be in South Beach. I want to be in hot weather. I want to be at a place where they also compensate me fairly. So those are great points that you can move forward with from the Heat's perspective at the very least.
And Udonis Haslem will still be on the roster in 5 years anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David, for joining in on this YouTube extended cut from the NBA podcast we had here. It's kind of a double dipper on this one. So if you're out there and you're thinking, what did these guys talk about before Jimmy? You'll find the link in the description below to our latest podcast. Hit that and you will find out and you'll listen to a lot more of Bryan and myself and, of course, David Ramil. So thank you for watching.